Welcome to the next of these conversations with us. I'm Nikki.
And I'm Scylla.
And today we are having a conversation about mental health. This is a huge issue today, not least with the pandemic that we are living through. Some research this year in June 2020 showed that 1 in 4 people in England will experience some kind of mental health problem each year, and that 1 in 6 people in England will experience a common mental health problem such as anxiety or depression every week. Today, we have the great privilege of talking to a consultant psychiatrist. He works with the NHS, he works in a private practice in Harley Street and elsewhere. He's a friend of ours, he comes to our church, to HTB. Dr. Chichi Obuaya, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to see you guys.
Oh, welcome, Chichi. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to you today.
Well, the irony, Scylla, is that, of course, under normal circumstances, we may not have had the opportunity to do this. My diary gets pretty full, and I'm sure we're going to talk a bit more about this, but there have been lots of losses during this period that's very difficult for everyone, but also lots of opportunities. For me personally, from an educational perspective, I've been able to attend lots of webinars. I'd like to think that today is a great opportunity for us to connect in a way that we may not have otherwise done.
Absolutely right.
It certainly is. And so it's amazing we've got this opportunity. Before we really get going with the conversation, it would just be lovely for everybody listening, if you would just tell us a bit about your family, because you have a wonderful family, we know.
Thank you. I thought you were going to ask me to talk about myself, which I hate doing. Well, you may hear 1 or 2 members of my family. I am working from home today. And as I was telling you just before we started this, the walls are a little bit thinner than I expected. This house was not renovated with a global pandemic in mind. And so you may hear the cries of baby Daniel, who's 8 months. My son Sam, my first son Sam, who's now 2 years old, may well knock on the door to say hello to everybody. And fortunately, number 1, Ruby, is 5 years old and she's in school today.
Okay. And is Dolly in the house with you too, your wife?
She is doing some errands in the kitchen, so she may also call my name, shout at me. So apologies to everyone watching.
Let's talk about mental health. And obviously we are in very unusual circumstances with the COVID pandemic. And we'd love you just to tell us really, I mean, I would think the overarching thing for many, many people is anxiety, but tell us what have been the pressures that you've seen put on people's mental health as a result of this pandemic, and perhaps particularly on marriages.
Wow, what a question. I can't think of a way in which people haven't been affected, to be honest. It's been a massive roller coaster, and every conceivable way in which someone's mental health could potentially be compromised, I've pretty much seen over the last 6 months. Every scenario you can think of. So from young people who live alone, maybe far from family members and friends, they may be working from the same room that they're sleeping in, and that's a real challenge because they're socially isolated. To parents who've got kids who may be in school, or kids who've returned home having fled the nest, and just all those difficulties of homeschooling and trying to work at the same time. Older people, again, who may really value spending time with their children or grandchildren and aren't able to do that. People who are in employment and their jobs are under threat. And in the UK, because I know that we've got a global audience, we had a big furlough scheme. So people were supported financially. And although that sounds great, for some people it's quite a big blow to their self-esteem. So even though they've returned to work, just all the uncertainty that creates. And for business owners, not knowing if projects can take off, if their businesses are viable. Every single way people could potentially be affected. They have been. So I think it's a bit of a cliche, but it has been a massive leveler for us because it's pretty much affected everybody and in at least some way. The rhythm to our lives has been disrupted. And it's not just that. I think it's also the coping mechanisms that we have. Being able to rely on friends, family. We said that we go to the same church, and not being able to access church, for example, in quite the same way. These are things we rely on to cope with challenges in our lives. And that includes challenges around marriage. And just to think about that more specifically, there's something ironic about the fact that people have had to slow down with work. And there's often this feeling that we both live in London. We all live in London. It's a big city. It's quite stressful, and people tend to commute into work. So particularly for couples and parents, life is very busy. And so we often fantasize about being able to spend more time at home with our spouses, but it does bring its own stresses. I can think personally of examples where, like today, I'm working from home, and probably after we finish talking, I might nip out to the bathroom before I resume my afternoon clinic. And that for me might be a brief break, chance to get some water, maybe even if I'm lucky, some fresh air. But from my wife's perspective, she will see me, and that's maybe a chance for her to have a break from looking after baby Daniel. So little things like that can just create a bit of pressure if there are differing expectations. So for some couples, spending more time with each other than they're used to spending has been really difficult for them, and they've had to find ways of managing to be around each other.
Now, Gigi, if you had to, let's say there were 3 pieces of advice, things that people could put into practice today to guard their own mental health, just thinking personally for a moment, what would you say? What would be your top 3 things to preserve, protect your own mental health?
The first one would be quite easy for me. If there was only one thing I could choose, sleep is absolutely top of the list. It has such a big impact on our mental health when we're not sleeping well. And if we stick with the theme of couples, and particularly parents, I'm sure we can all attest to the fact that when we're sleep deprived, we can all get a little bit irritable. And so that's the perfect recipe for arguments, misunderstanding, poor communication. But generally speaking, for our mental health, we should try and ensure that we're getting good sleep. And that links into number 2, which would be our daytime structure. That's the thing that's been massively disrupted. And again, there are lots of positives of working from home and not having to travel in. But that the rhythm of having to get ready and get dressed and get out of the house and maybe walk to public transport, those things have been lost. And one of the things that helps us to do is it compartmentalizes our home life and working life. So one has to be more intentional in thinking about what the daytime actually looks like. And thirdly, linked to that again, I would say movement and exercise, particularly as we're demonstrating very effectively right now. We're spending quite a lot of our days sitting down in front of the screen and not moving as much as we perhaps need to. So thinking of ways of just breaking that up, jumping on a bike and going for a quick bike ride just to loosen things up. I'll probably do that after this very stressful interview. or going for a walk or going for a run. And again, things that we would perhaps normally access, like the gym or going for a swim, may not be possible. So being creative in how we do that.
Thank you, Gigi. Sleep, daily structure, exercise. I'll remember those 3.
And Gigi, can you kind of shed some light for us on what are the signs that somebody, I mean, our partner perhaps might be, or a child or a teenager in the family might be showing signs of mental health, of stress, of anxiety, of just the many number of things, depression, that can start to come? What are the kind of signs? What are the things to look out for that somebody might be, gosh, what's going on? I don't really know.
Scilla, I think it's really important to emphasize that there are a broad range of mental health conditions. So let's be careful and not generalize too much, but there are some common themes, and we've touched on those when we think about the top tips for maintaining good mental health. So one helpful concept is to think about mental health or mental well-being and mental ill health as occurring on a continuum. So the idea that there's a spectrum, and at one end of that spectrum, where we want to be, is effectively thriving. So that's when you're able to just stand up and say, yeah, I think I feel pretty good. Now, what are the sorts of markers that would signify that? Good sleep, structure, and exercise. I guess limiting the amount of media we're consuming, paying attention to our nutrition, which again can be quite nuanced depending on one's circumstances. Being outward focused and also thinking positively about the future. So to answer your question, the opposite of that is a state that we can refer to as languishing. That's not a diagnosis, but we could think about that as an at-risk state that potentially puts us at risk of developing depression or an anxiety disorder, or if we have an existing mental health problem, that could somehow be exacerbated. So the opposite things would be sleeping very poorly, and poor sleep might be linked to the fact that we're obsessively watching what's going on in the news, and therefore our brains are very busy. We don't feel relaxed when it's time to go to sleep. Not having a structure. I talked about the challenges of maybe working from home, and if you're just rolling out of bed, switching on your laptop, and then you're able to start your working day, it starts to get into some dangerous territory there, because we're not really getting up and about and moving around sufficiently. I think becoming very inwardly focused, so just thinking about ourselves and not being able to really consider other people, to have that degree of empathy, is a pretty significant red flag. We are at home. We're in closer proximity to our fridges at the moment. And therefore there are things there that we're going to potentially use as coping mechanisms. I'm thinking specifically of food and alcohol. That's another one. I have found that people are, generally speaking, drinking a bit more, and that might be because it's more available. It's also a way of managing anxiety. And we know that alcohol can help you to relax. Some people also drink to help them sleep, and it will get you to sleep, but it will worsen the quality of your sleep if drinking levels are going up in any consistent fashion. So these are some of the things that might just start to appear. And I think as a spouse, I would encourage people not to be confrontational if they're starting to see these things, but this is about creating those opportunities for conversations. So having a foundation, and this is something you guys taught us when we did the marriage course, carving out the time. I think you need time as a couple to deal with the practical stuff. So when are you doing the next food delivery? How are we going to keep the kids entertained? All those sorts of things. What are we doing this weekend? If you haven't created enough time, what happens then is that the time that you need to be connecting with each other as a couple, you also need to do the admin. So you've got less of the connection time. And that's where, again, you're just creating the conditions for misunderstanding and frustration. So one encouragement for couples is create enough time, but also understand what you're doing with that time. And you guys are big proponents of date night. That's maybe even a layer above that. But there's something really important about regular connection. We all have administrative tasks that we need to do, so give that the time and attention it deserves. But make sure you're just checking in with each other, finding out how you're doing. And within that, when you're then identifying areas of concern, you've got a better opportunity to address them sensitively.
Gigi, you've talked about, how we protect ourselves. You started to talk about how we help each other and having that time together, checking in with each other. Would you just talk for a moment about family, where there are children, for some people, maybe young children in the home like yourselves, for others, older children, and then the wider family. I know many people are separated from their wider family. That's really painful. And I imagine you would agree that wider family can be very important for people's mental health. What do you see as the role of family, nuclear family and wider family, in terms of preserving, protecting mental health?
Wow, great question, Nikki. And I think we've got to be sensitive to the fact that people have very different experiences. And let's go in at the less comfortable end. Some people have really difficult relationships with their family members. If we just step away from the pandemic situation, one of the busiest times of the year for me in my clinic is around the end of November, early December. And the reason for that, it's not to do with the commercialization of Christmas. It's the challenge of facing family members where there are difficult relationships within the family. And that itself, just the anticipation of that for some people is enough to push them towards maybe experiencing a worsening of their depression. So people are facing really difficult circumstances. Some people would prefer to be a bit separate from their family members. I'm thinking of maybe younger people who may have moved away for university or have been working, and maybe as universities ended or jobs have come to an end or they've been furloughed, they've pretty much been forced to move home, and that can be really difficult. If I just take one specific area, I sometimes see people who have difficult relationships with food and are formally diagnosed with an eating disorder. And one of the real challenges there is taking control over what they eat, when they eat it, and where. And so being back at home and having to have a greater level of scrutiny can be really tough if you're already experiencing what we call a punitive self-ego. So you have very negative thoughts about your self-identity. So that can just be reinforced from being with family members. On the flip side, one of the things I mentioned is that we have support networks. Church is one of those. Family is a really important one as well. Families can help us with our problem solving. There are challenges, difficulties we're experiencing, and families are a resource for helping us work our way through those things. So it is important that people, where they have those more positive experiences, are able to connect with family members. We have to accept the circumstances we're in. I know that if we're looking across generations, some couples may be really dependent on their own parents to provide some childcare, and that may not be possible. We have to accept where we are, and those losses are real, and it's not about glossing over those, but one has to try and be creative. If I could give one example, my parents live about an hour away from our house, and we'd see them fairly regularly. We've been able to do some visiting, but of course it's not the same as we would like it to be. But one way in which we've been able to do things a little bit differently, my daughter's reading, and she loves being able to pick up the phone and doing a video call to her grandparents. And that's an amazing way for them to connect. in a way that they wouldn't have done 7 or 8 months ago.
That's
So,
amazing. You use that example. I've heard that from about 4 grandparents doing exactly the same. And it's a brilliant, brilliant thing in terms of everybody's well-being, I think.
so it's not about just waiting for our circumstances to change. It's working with the constraints that we face and trying to be creative where possible, but also accepting that there are certain things that we're missing at this time, and that's okay. I think we've got to take a realistic viewpoint on these things.
So, Chi, if somebody is overwhelmed in one way or another in their emotions, and they need extra help, just tell us about the kind of best ways for people to access the help that they need professionally from the doctor or other professionals.
So accessing help is, of course, going to vary from place to place in terms of what's available. One of the great things that I think has happened this year is that the ability to access help, I'm thinking in particular digitally, has really improved. And I think it's something that people have embraced. Again, I say that with sensitivity because it's frustrating for people maybe who can't access the doctors face to face. One of the great things about mental health, though, is that generally speaking, we can do most, if not all, of what we need to do using this sort of video technology. I can't remember where my stethoscope is. I haven't used it for a long time. I've been doing a lot of my appointments remotely. I happen to be seeing some people face to face, but technology is our friend when it comes to our mental health. But even before we think about professional support, think about the people that are in your network who may be the conduit to you then accessing help. We mustn't forget those informal support networks that we have. So, broadly speaking, we have GPs or family doctors who are the first port of call in many countries. They are trained to a pretty good level in understanding mental health conditions, and where they're accessible, they should definitely be people that you could run any difficulties you're experiencing by. You also then have psychologists and psychiatrists. Psychiatrists are medically trained doctors who specialize in mental health, and psychologists and psychotherapists have experience in supporting people in their psychological well-being. So there's less of a focus on illness as such, and it's really a way of thinking about difficulties you may be experiencing and how you can be best supported in addressing whatever it is you want to address. Also within the workplace, we mustn't forget that increasingly there is support around mental well-being, and that might be in the form of coaching, but also thinking about relationships with your line manager or your boss at work and how they may be able to help you to get the support that you need.
Great, thank you. That advice could be making a real difference to somebody today who is listening to this. What are the first steps that they take? I want to just get back for a moment. You've talked a bit about in a marriage, with a partner, how do you support each other? You mentioned some things that were very helpful. You talked about the time. You talked about checking in. Again, if I can use the same thing, just if you had to have 3 top tips for a couple in terms of supporting each other in this season, what would they be?
I think the first thing to say would be asking questions and not making assumptions. That really comes from having those conversations and not jumping to conclusions about what's going on for your partner. People are being affected in lots of different ways. And if we just take anxiety, for instance, even to this day, some people have anxiety primarily around maybe contracting COVID-19, or might be the children that they're worried about their safety. But there may be more of an indirect effect. So they may be worried about work, or the fact that there's more pressure in their job and they feel that their job is under threat, or the school run is more stressful. It could be a whole range of things. And I think there's a danger sometimes that we think we know what's going on and we jump in. So firstly, asking the right questions. I think secondly, understanding what your role is as a spouse. And I'm speaking to the men here. And I think this is coming from experience as well. As men, we're often trying to be very much solution focused. And sometimes what's needed is just for you to listen and to acknowledge and to validate what your partner's going through. And that might actually be all that's required. For you to turn off the TV, I'm speaking to myself here, pay attention, listen and acknowledge. It's not about finding the answer. It's just a way of sharing that problem. And maybe the solution will come further down the line. But in that moment, what you're being asked to do is to demonstrate that you've actually listened, that you've heard what's going on, and that might be enough. So keeping it really, really simple. And I think the third thing for me would be not being afraid to sensitively share that outside of your dyad, so your actual couple relationship, and just thinking together about at what point some external help is needed.
Thank you.
Gigi, that is fantastic advice.
Yeah, oh my
you.
goodness. And
can I add a bonus one?
You can add a fourth, yeah?
Yes.
I'm not sure that it's a tip. It's more just an important thing to bear in mind when we're thinking about couples. And there's another one if we're parents as well. So I think it's important for us to recognize that there is our core self. There's a bit of identity that is bound with our role as a spouse. And then for those of us that have children, your role as a parent. And there's a juggling act that we're working through. And this happens at the best of times. But I think it's fair to say that there's a bit more pressure here for a lot of people at the moment, for the reasons that we've outlined. Maybe you're spending more time at home, and you're spending more time at home, but you're actually busier at work, and the confusion that can cause. So it's about taking care of each of those buckets, making sure that you're paying attention to your own well-being, making sure that you're giving adequate time to your relationship and fulfilling your duties, if you like, as a spouse. And then also making sure that you're doing what you need to do as a parent, because there's a tendency for us to focus on one to the detriment of at least one of the other two, if not both. And I think during this season, everyone's worried about kids and schools, so we can veer towards what do we need to do as parents. But actually, have you guys as a couple spent time talking during the last week and feeding your relationship? And if you're paying attention to those two things, are you giving yourself adequate time to maybe go for a run or have time to do a bit of reading? So it's a constant juggling act. It's not easy, but I think one has to just be aware of that and give each other the necessary time to pay attention to those 2 or 3 areas.
Oh, fantastically helpful.
Really helpful. Really great advice.
Chichi, we could go on talking all day. I know that we need to get to work, but we'd love to ask you a final question, which is really around your faith. And we'd just love to know what difference your Christian faith makes in the work that you do.
Makes a huge difference, Scylla, and it's hard to drill it down to any one thing. My work can be pretty intense. I think this year has been very full on. I'm very blessed and fortunate that I've been kept pretty busy, but at times it can feel overwhelming. I'm a human being just like anybody else, and I think my faith just gives me that bit of perspective in terms of why I'm doing what I do, and also the ability to persevere. The book of Galatians tells us or encourages us not to grow weary in doing good. And there are times when I certainly feel irritable. I find my work frustrating, and I just want to back off. And I just have that reminder as to what I'm doing this for. So my faith just sits at the very center of the work that I do. And when I need to go to the well, it's my faith that is driving me on.
Dr. Chichi Obwe, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you, Chichi.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.